Tēnei te mihi kia koutou katoa mai ngā tōpatu o tēnei whenua, o tī rā, huri nui te ao nei. Tēnei e mihi ana kia koutou I puta mai ki te tautoko I tēnei kaupapa. Kia ora everybody from Aotearoa and around the world. Special shout out to my Irish cousins that seem to have joined us, and everybody else as well from around the world. We're going to start with karakia, because the work that's involved with this report is just not words on paper. We're also dealing with people here and loss of life, loss of our whare tangata, or women, children, grandchildren, and our men also that disappear into incarceration. So it's important in Māori thought that we enter into this in the right way, making sure that we have protection. So we're going to start with karakia. Kia ora tātou. Me noi tātou. Tā kiri ko te ata, ka rere ko te rā, ko rihi ta manu, kururi, korora. Hihi ana mai ana tamanui ta rā, kia puta tātou ki te ao mārama. Tēnei au, ko te hokai nei I taku tapu ai. Ko te hokai nui, ko te hokai nuku, ko te hokai ato tūpuna a tāne nui ārangi. I piki tia ai, ki te rangi tū ha, ki te tihi o manono. I roko hina atu rā, ko e o mato kore anake. I riro iho ai ngā kete o te wānanga, ko te kete tua uri, ko te kete tua te, ko te kete aro nui. Ka tiri a, ka pau a, kia papa tuanoku. Ka puta te ira tangata ki te whai ao, ki te ao marama. Whano, haramai te toki. Haumi e, hui e, tā ki e. Nō reira, tēnā tātou. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar for the launch of this report, Men Who Use Violence. The report is to begin a discussion. The report is to focus on the inequities within the system that continue to perpetuate and accentuate the present situation, where women and children in the past have been removed and re-victimized, where men have not really had a focus put on the support and help that we require to move past the use of violence. Men are incarcerated, and sometimes in that incarceration, death also happens. And this is also connected with other reports that have been released around the high suicide rates here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So for these reasons, we start with karakia and we close with karakia. Nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa, I'd like to pass the time back to Janet. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Dennis, and thank you so much for setting the scene so beautifully. And so my name is Janet Fonslow. I'm an associate professor at the School of Population Health and have the honor of co-directing the New Zealand Family Violence Clearinghouse, which is New Zealand's National Centre for Family and Whānau Violence Information. I am delighted to be helping to co-host this webinar hosted by the New Zealand Family Violence Clearinghouse on behalf of the Family Violence Death Review Committee, and their latest in a series of always informative and always challenging reports. We have been overwhelmed with the amount of interest that there has been in this seminar. We have sold out two lots of 500 registrants, and we are so delighted that so many of you are willing to prioritize this in your morning when you have a lot of other calls on your time. For those who weren't able to attend or who want to pick up on the information later, do know we are recording this session and we will make links to that recording available later. And also, I see that many of you are probably, Zoom experts by now in our bubbles, but just to say that this is the Clearinghouse's second webinar ever. So if there's a few technical issues that you have along the way, please feel free to email or send a chat to the hosts, and we'll see how well we can sort it out for you. Do also remember that you got a cheat sheet of technical fixes yesterday that might also help you if you're experiencing any difficulties. So my job for today is, as host, is to run through a little bit of the housekeeping for the session, the Zoom housekeeping. I'll also be in the role of timekeeper, and then finally to introduce participants. So as you will have discovered already, as participants, your microphones are set to mute and your cameras are off. And unlike usual Zoom meetings, you can't alter that. But it does mean that you're safe to do what you need to in your bubble with nobody else being able to see or hear you. There is a question and answer function attached to this webinar, and so if you wish to direct questions to any of the presenters, please use the question and answer forum, and we will also try and have a question and answer session at the end. If you have chats, which I see many of you are already using, please feel free to use that to chat if you want to send a message to the whole group of almost 1,000, or if you want to just send a message privately to the presenters. The final thing I just need to mention is, as Dennis has indicated, we need to be very respectful with the space that we're in, and the final thing that we need to the final thing that we just want to mention before we start is, in the interest of holding the space respectfully for people, we do reserve the right to remove any participants who are not behaving by those rules. So if any people are making comments in the chats that we consider to be disrespectful or offensive, we will reserve the right to remove those presenters. All right, with the housekeeping finished, I will hand over, I will just run through a list of the presenters that we'll have today. So first up, we will have Professor Jane Colsio-McLean, who is chair of the Family Violence Death Review Committee. And she will be running through some details on the presentation and from the report. She'll be followed by three speakers: Jeremy Aparema, who is a motivational speaker on the prevention of domestic violence; Tim Marshall from the Tauafi Men's Center; and Nicola Woodward, from who is the director of B Company. And in the background, just so you know, we also do have a skilled team of knowledge experts. We have Fiona Cram, who is the chair of Nawai Arawhenua, which is the Māori caucus for the Mortality Death Review Committees, also supported by Michael Raguski, who is one of the co-authors of the report and also part of Napo Arawhenua, as well as Pauline Gulliver, who's the senior specialist for the Family Violence Death Review Committee, and Nicola Payton from the Family Violence Clearinghouse. So the people will all be there in the background to help support and answer your questions. All right, it's now time to pass over to Jane. Jane, your turn.
Kia ora, good morning. I'm going to share my screen. We're going to try this. And can you see the screen? Janet, maybe you can just nod for me. Great. Very good. Very good. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I want to thank Dennis for your korero in bringing us together today and reminding us that it is with deep respect for all those who have been impacted by family violence death that we do our mahi. I'd also like to acknowledge the path that this report has taken, with contributions from many people, too many to be named, but many who have been involved in the collection and analysis of the information that has provided the evidence for this report. In particular, I want to thank our current senior specialist for the committee, Dr. Pauline Gulliver. Many thanks. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Fiona Cram and the Napo Arawhenua Committee, which, as Janet mentioned, is the committee of the Māori members of the Health Quality and Safety Commission Mortality Review Committees. Their Te Po Māori rubric has been a valuable tool to assist with interpreting and reporting Māori mortality. In our short time together, I will briefly share the committee's reframing that is described in the report. We hope that it joins with the community and those working at the coalface to create a safe environment for change. And as Dennis said, this is only a beginning. Throughout the committee's work, we seek to challenge the thinking and assumptions that underlie our responses to family violence in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Using a complexity lens, we constantly ask ourselves, why did the response happen that way? In our fifth data reports, we found that in addition to the entrapment of social isolation, fear, and coercion by a partner, women who have been killed are also entrapped, along with their children, by the indifference of institutions to their suffering, and also by the structural inequities of gender, class, and racism. In light of social entrapment, it was evidence to us that to ensure victim safety, rather than holding women accountable for their safety and the safety of their children, we needed to draw our attention to the men who use violence. In this report, the 97 male predominant aggressors involved in an intimate partner violence death within the scope of the Family Violence Death Review Committee provided the basis for our analysis that we present in the sixth report. As with all our work examining family violence, we do not limit our analysis to the death event, but rather we take a life course approach. For this report, we examined the life course patterns of the 97 men and of the agencies they came in contact with. We looked for opportunities to change men's development trajectory for them to move away from using violence. To get the story right, the committee's understanding of family violence is that focusing on the individual or their intimate partner relationship alone does not adequately represent the complexity of factors contributing to the likelihood of violence occurring. We need to consider our current and historic societal structures. In the sixth report, we use Angus MacFarlane's Braided River model to understand the impact of colonization on both Māori and Pākehā. We highlight how colonization dismantled natural supports evident in traditional Māori society, and how patriarchy became embedded in societal structures and provided unchecked privilege for Pākehā men. For example, a man's expectation of being heard and believed when reporting an incident to the police. In the sixth report, we identify that, like the women primary victims of intimate partner homicide, the men who use violence are active help seekers across a range of services. They reach out throughout their life journey in schools, in engagement with care, later in mental health and addiction services. The men come into contact with Oranga Tamariki, police, family court, corrections, and a host of agencies. Yet what we see repeatedly is that their help seeking is not met with an effective response. They are not provided help when and where they need it. Things that stop an effective response include, for example, a lack of investment in the emotional development of boys and men as fathers, Service thresholds, such as when program eligibility criteria require severe illness prior to being able to access the service, or the isolation between services, such as stopping violence program in one place and alcohol and drug services in another. And finally, responses that are typically short-term responses that address a single issue rather than a response for what is a complex problem. A more holistic response is needed. In our analysis, we also found an impact of structural inequalities. For example, the likelihood of a custodial sentence for the 32 Māori men in our reviews prior to the death event was 84%. This compared to a substantially lower proportion of 32% for the 41 Pākehā men. We know that incarceration, when associated with engagement with state care, has been described as alienation, institutional marginalization, and loss of individual and collective cultural identity. In our report, we outline the experience of both individual and collective chronic and complex trauma experienced by the men who use violence. Without appropriate intervention, it is not surprising where that coping strategies were commonly destructive, both to the men themselves as well as to those around them. An understanding of the impact of violence and trauma is required to create emotionally and physically safe environments for engaging with services. A trauma and violence-informed practice involves asking, what has happened? What have you tried before? How did it go? What has worked for you? Rather than asking, what is wrong with you? In our report, we outline a range of ways of working that are consistent with trauma and violence-informed practice. Listed here are just a few. For example, understanding the potential for healing and recovery with the necessary and appropriate support. To realize a trauma and violence-informed approach, there are some critical service gaps that need to be addressed. For example, upskilling for those who work with men, recognizing men's contribution as fathers. There's currently little training for those who work for men. Few community resources are available. Men's roles as fathers are hidden, and finally, our current support services are insufficiently resourced to work with men while keeping the safety of women and children as a priority. The rethinking that we have outlined in our report argues for a response that is holistic and flexible in providing services when and where the services are needed, and forever long that those services are needed. The recommendations in our report address a pathway for trauma and violence-informed practices, flexible commissioning of services, shared understandings, and individual and collective healing and restoration. In our recommendations, we also pose a range of reflective questions, such as this one. In what ways are we encouraging creative and collaborative service delivery so agencies provide the right help at the right time? In publicly introducing our report, the committee recognizes that those in the community hold the knowledge about the needs of those in their communities. They are key to having linked up accessible services that provide support and services to men in holistic ways over the long term. We've just skipped here. Let me get back to the slide. Sorry about that. My apologies. And we'll finish up. Yes, so community organizations and the community members are at the forefront of early intervention and prevention responses. In this first public forum to discuss the report, we have therefore invited representatives from the community to speak to the report and share their knowledge in identifying solutions. We are very honored to have with us today 3 expert community members. They are experts in understanding their communities and working with men and whānau and families. So to begin our next speaker, I'm going to hand over to Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And kia ora tātou katoa. He mihi tuatai ki a koe Dennis mō tō whakatau I a mātou I tēnei ata. Kia koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou. I would firstly like to again acknowledge those whānau and families out there that have been and are still being affected by the world and dynamics of family violence, particularly those that have lost loved ones to it. Secondly, to the Death Review Committee for the great work that you have done while putting this report and your recommendations together, and for allowing me to be part of this, which is an acknowledgement and an important aspect that men who have had and are still involved in this pattern of behaviour need to be included and have a voice in finding the solutions to change. To my fellow speakers and to all of you tuned in for caring enough, having a heart for this kaupapa, and those that work in this area which is so confronting and sad on a daily basis, thank you. The topics I would like to address today are: why do men use violence? Difficulties around finding and engaging help when time is right for that individual, the current model offered, and the possible solutions to bridging the gaps that exist in that current model. My views and opinions are drawn from my own experiences as a victim and former perpetrator of domestic violence, and from the insights and the conversations I've had with men and people who work in this sector over the last 8 years while working for the It's Not Okay campaign as a motivational prevention speaker of domestic violence. So why do men use violence? If you take an angry man who has chosen to use violence in adult life and peel back the layers, eventually you will get down to a scared little boy who has suffered trauma and abuse for prolonged periods in their own home at the hands of perpetrator or perpetrators, which in most cases has been a member of their whānau or family, parents, older siblings, aunties, uncles, where the environment is supposed to be one of love, nurturing and protection. Outside of the home, it continues with other adults in places of power and control, teachers, coaches, police, etc. This prolonged abuse causes the child to change. They normalise the behaviour, it becomes their normal. One of the most monumental things that happens to you during this time is you lose trust in people. That loss of trust and the internal barriers that are put up to help you cope remain with you all your life, or until you get to a time when you are ready and able to seek help. In a nutshell, most men using violence have grown up without being given, in their own homes, all the skills and the tools from role models, or the lack of good role models, to be able to make a fully informed and educated choice in their lives. And it will remain so until intervention at the right time and the right words, and most importantly, the right person presents itself. The difficulties around finding and engaging help. For so long, the emphasis of the agencies and help available has been victim orientated, rightly so, and set up for the bottom of the cliff. We are slowly moving to a focus on prevention as a sector. Throughout this report, it recognises and backs up the facts that we need to be working with perpetrators as well, not incarcerating, shaming, or writing them off as bad people. I used to think I was a bad man but was assured by a facilitator I just had bad behaviour. We would do well to remember this when dealing with the people. So at this current time across the country, there remains a serious lack of agencies, venues and personnel equipped to give you that help. We say it's okay to ask for help, but truthfully, are we as a country able and equipped enough to provide this help for everyone seeking it? You may have noticed that I talk about an individual's timing quite a lot. It is imperative that we understand in order for someone to make change in their lives, it's about timing, and it's their time, not ours, not the system. It's up to us to plant seeds, give advice, and try and lead them to that time, but ultimately they choose when they are ready. Which leads me nicely into number 3, the current model available. The current model we operate with, particularly for perpetrators, is punitive, power and controlling, and shame-based. A chap is going about his daily life. Yes, it's dysfunctional. Yes, it's violent. But because of his belief and value system, it's normal. Even if you have a feeling that this doesn't feel right, you don't have the tools or the skills to change your behaviour. Suddenly one day a police officer comes to your home and serves you with a PO, protection order. For some, they can't read it, let alone understand it. All they are told is they cannot have any contact with their partner and in most cases their children. They are forced to go to an anger management course. Bear in mind I have just talked about timing. So this guy who, as I said earlier, has lost trust and has not trusted anyone fully since he was a kid, is thrust into a situation that he is not ready for and told he has to go every week, or it will be deemed as a breach with the possible consequence of jail. In a lot of towns and areas in New Zealand, there aren't anger management groups in the community, so he has to travel half an hour to attend and be expected to engage in sharing, soul-searching, raking up childhood trauma and memories, and trusting the people from the group that are in a place of power and control, that same place from where his trust was lost. He completes his up to 20-week course, some shorter, and goes on his way with some new skills and tools that he has, if he brought into the sessions. This is supposedly enough to create and maintain change for the rest of his life. Fixed. 20 plus years of trauma and abuse fixed in just 20 weeks. Do you think? So what about the guy that has got to this place and time on his own, ready to make change to help himself and his family, but still has the same challenges as the mandated guy, like trust, shame, childhood trauma, no venue in town, travel expenses. He rocks up to a venue and is stopped at the door because he is not mandated to be there. Just wants help. We can't help you because you don't meet a threshold, or we are not funded for walk-ins. So the message to this guy is to go home and beat up his wife or partner. Once you're in the system, we can help. I'm not saying this happens everywhere, but it does happen. So it's taken this guy years to get to this point in his life to ask for help. And because of a knockback, for whatever reason, he may not ask again for another 5 to 10 years, or never again. So possible solutions. So the solutions have been out there in the minds and hearts of you that have worked in the sector for years. And those of you that have left the sector after becoming disillusioned, after years of struggling with small budgets, policies and red tape that actually hinder your work. We need a lower threshold for engagement, earlier intervention, by providing a safe, welcoming environment where trust can be built, and a workforce of fully resourced and fully trained personnel who have a full understanding of all the dynamics of living in a world of domestic violence, empathy for those trapped in it, not judgment or condemnation, Be able to walk alongside the individuals for as long as it takes. No time limits. No specified amount of sessions. Each person is different in many ways. Their learning capabilities, other addictions, other life stresses, etc. So the one model fits all is not the way. If we want a better success rate and less risk of reoffending, then we need to add an element to personalised programs for each individual. Get them on their way and stay in regular contact to assist in the journey. Work together with the whole whānau or family unit, culturally and personally, giving them a far greater chance of breaking the cycle. This report speaks all the way through of the points I have raised and what a lot of you have wished for ages. Fingers and toes crossed that some, if not all, the recommendations become part of a revamped or new model to end this curse on our country. I'd now like to pass over to my other two learned colleagues, starting with Tim. So thank you very much.
Oh, I'm seeing myself. Yeah, kia ora Jeremy, kia ora whānau, ngā mihi mahana ki a koutou, tautoko ngā mihi. Ko mia, kia hoki, kia koe Dennis I whakatūwhera te wānanga kōrero o te ata nei, nō reira ane te mihi atu ki a koe I tika me whaipakaro ki ngā mate I pāna ki tēnei kaupapa e mahi tūkino ki wangi te pānei. So thanks for having me. I want to tautoko the welcome to everybody and thank Dennis for opening us up and reminding us actually about the stories of these men and women that are subject to the report. And it's a privilege to have this opportunity to talk to you alongside Jeremy and Nicola and share some thoughts. So if I could just go to my first slide, please. So the first thing that struck out for me when you read the report is on page 2, there's a series of 0800 numbers. And as Jeremy said, the family violence campaign say it's okay to ask for help, but it's not very obvious often if you're a man where to find that. And those 0800 numbers, if you look down the list, there's not too many that appeal, that reach out for men asking for help. So if you're in that situation where you think, actually, maybe I might want to, I'm reading this thing and it's impacting me, or I'm seeing something, and you look down that list, you're often not going to find the 0800 number that you feel fits with you. And then as the report has said, even if you do find that help, it's not often responsive to your needs. So if I can just move on to the next slide, please. So as we've heard the summary of the report, we've had a system response for many years, which hasn't changed a huge amount in the last probably 20 or 30 years, which talks about short-term interventions, trying to address long-term issues. So as Jeremy said, we're trying to change 20 years of behaviour with 12 weeks of program, and a focus also in the system on compliance and completion rather than safety and real behaviour change. Again, we looked at, when you think about the whangaia and ISR models, which are really great interventions and collaborative approaches from the system, they continue to be inside-out approaches. So it's still the system operating and impacting on whānau and community, designed from inside outward rather than outside in. We heard also about the doubling down of colonisation and patriarchy and what that leads to. And the thing that stuck out for me, particularly as a middle-class Pākehā man in this space, is that the power of unchecked privilege and how that plays out in families, but not only that, how that plays out when this violence comes to light. And I think we need to bring this into the light. It was interesting for me that 42% of the men that were recorded in this report were of European descent, and how we're responding to that issue in the system in our community. And of course, that's all set in the context of an unhealthy model of masculinity. People might know about the man blocks, Tony Porter's work, around the messages that we get as men of what it means to be a man. And what it means when we get under pressure is that we either hurt out, which is causing violence to those people we love or should be caring for, or we hurt in, which means we end our own lives, which means that we continue to lead the negative statistics around that. So if I can have my next slide, please. So I wanted to talk about some solutions. One of the things that stuck out for me was the interaction of us as men, as fathers, and the importance of the first 1,000 days, and how many of the men that I've worked with over the years have very little idea of child development and that impact of the environment on our young children, and then go on to repeat the cycle. And a lot of the men we work with get sent to parenting programs which are highly content driven and don't have a basic foundation of what it means to be a man. And I also thought that perhaps in terms of toe-talking what Jeremy was saying, we have short-term responses. Perhaps we should think about the next 1,000 days of a man's life, play the long game so that we're in there for the long haul. Those people who work in the recovery space will tell you that early recovery is 3 to 5 years, but our interventions are way shorter than that, within 2 or 3 months or 6 months if we're lucky. And also we need to change the narrative. As Jeremy said, we need to change the narrative from bad men to bad behaviour. Let's attack the behaviour, not the man. Let's hear the story. Let's encourage men to speak their truth, including their own trauma. And I want to shout out to Ken Fairwater and the whānau who work with male survivors, because the same man box mentality that gets into the space of perpetrating violence like this is the same man box mentality that causes the shame of us to speak up when we're victims as well. And let's build a new definition of masculinity, reminding us that emotions are human qualities and don't belong to feminine or masculine. So I can have the next slide, please. So some of the work we've been doing, this is a call to men. So in the same way, I recently heard Moana Jackson talk about the responsibility for dismantling colonisation was on the colonisers. So if we see this issue in terms of the men's violence towards women, the responsibility of us men is to step up, to share our part of the workload, of a workload that's often been driven for many years by women. And so we've been doing some of that work. You might recognise a couple of chaps in that picture there. Change is possible, Jeremy on the left there, and some of these hui that we've been running around the country, creating the space, a safe space for men to share and be inspired by Jeremy and Vic and Phil and others who shared their story and empower the belief that actually change is possible. And we've also connected as men working in the sector with each other across the country and now have a network, informal at this stage, but we're hoping to build on that. And I think that's an opportunity from this report that we can build on. Can I have the next slide, please? In our little space of the world in Tairāwhiti, we had a community response. So we lost 5 whānau to murder-suicides. 3 men got into that dark space where they wanted to end their life, but before that they wanted to end the life of their person that they most loved. And two of those men had no previous engagement with any system, so they were part of the 80% that we talk about. We need a place for men to have conversations and men to have conversations with other men. And I just saw that popped up the 800 Hey Bro, and I noticed that that wasn't on page 2, so I want to mihi out to the Hey Bro whānau from down there. And I just also wanted to mention, so the men in the picture there in the middle have an average of 5 years involvement with tawawhi, and of those 5 years, for many of them, the changes still continue, but we've just stuck with them for the long haul. The shortest, but they're also the men, that have made the biggest change. They've come from serious trauma and changed their life for the good and are now creating support for other men. The other picture on there, the Dad and Me, which is responding to the needs of men as fathers and encouraging. We created a foundation parenting program, did it at a basic level and started with a question, what does it actually mean to be a dad? And then unpack that, which provides the foundation for going further into that conversation and the more content-heavy programs. And as our slogan says, we want to create a community of caring men, So we believe if we have men that care for each other and care for their whānau and community, we'll deal with some of these negative issues. Can have the last slide, please. So here's a new vision, and I noticed Sonia is on from Safe Man Family. I want to mihi atu kia koe, Sonia. And you might recognise this chapter here. So Vic, Safe Man Family talks about a program of action, peer-led, professionally supportive. It came out of Vic's own journey, and like Jeremy said, Vic finished the program in 1992 and spent the next 10 years trying to find all the other pieces of the puzzle that he needed to sustain his change. And 10 years later, when his daughter said to him that he forgave her, that was a recognition for Vic that he had become what he described as the safe man. So as we said, it wasn't the court, it wasn't probation, it wasn't childhood and family. It was the family who knew the man before and could see the man now that had changed, who could give proof to the fact that he had actually sustained that change. Safe Man, Safe Family is based on a foundation of lived experience, as it's described now, trauma-informed, and it's to uncover, discover, and recover from all forms of violence. And I just wanted to leave you with that quote, which you might have seen before. If you always do what you've always done, you always get what you've always got. It's time for change. Kia ora tātou. Oh, sorry, I'd like to pass on to Nicola to complete our kōrero.
Kia ora, thanks very much, Tim, and to all the speakers. I think that you'll hear as I talk a helpful consistency between the key issues and the opportunities that everybody has talked about over the past 30 minutes or so. But first, I'd like to open by acknowledging all the frontline staff that are out there doing amazing work, which has been made all the more difficult over the past couple of months because of COVID-19. And this is because COVID-19 will be experienced by many men who use violence as a form of entrapment, and as a result of the psychological effects of this entrapment experience, including growing anxiety, they are at greater risk of using more violence, and for the severity of that violence to potentially increase. Next slide, please. So in the brief time that we have together, I've been asked to talk about our structures and systems. And as many folk know, this means beginning with mindset, because mindset is the mother of structure. Mindset, whether it's by accident or design, is the fundamental driver of our response to family violence, which has for many years, as has already been acknowledged, has been characterised by the binary adult victim perpetrator paradigm. This report, the committee's fifth report, call for a systems approach. However, to achieve a sustainable systems approach, we actually first need to co-create a systems mindset. And I see this as probably our most significant collaborative leadership challenge and opportunity, because without a systems mindset, we will, I think, almost inevitably default to our siloed model, which is our current model, when the going gets tough or we're faced with conflicting or competitive interests, which for a number of reasons is both understandable and not at all uncommon. Next slide, please. So Tim's already talked about the 80-20 challenge, and I'd just like to add to this very briefly. This government has set a vision of an Aotearoa New Zealand in which children grow up in violence-free homes. All children grow up in violence-free homes. This has to mean shifting proportionately from the current 2080 to a strategic 80-20 approach. We know, and we have for a very long time, that only about 20-25% of family violence episodes come to the attention of police. And we also know that most men using violence won't be named as respondents on protection orders. So this means that most men, most of the time, have little to no access to government-funded services. The same is also true for most women, young people, and children. I think it's worth noting that our binary victim-perpetrator paradigm has focused intentionally or otherwise on adults with little to no specialist regard to the service needs of younger male adults and adolescents with concerning and violent behaviours both before and as they enter intimate partner relationships. So this is an important 80-20 service gap. Slide, please. So whilst within this context, becoming entrapped is the consequence of intentionally violent, coercive and controlling behaviours, there are a number of drivers within our entrapment systems and structures that can either perpetuate or help to overcome language. We've talked about thresholds. It's come up in the report, and Jeremy has also talked about thresholds, as has Tim. The title of the committee's sixth report is notable for its reference to men who use violence instead of perpetrators. Stigma and shame is powered by language and conversely disempowered by language. When we need men who are using or at risk of using violence to reach out and engage voluntarily with service, and that's the 80% plus that we're talking about, our invitation must be hopeful and it must be manner enhancing, even if we don't feel that they've yet earned our respect. Whilst our aim is to hold violent men to account is understandable and necessary, few men are likely to reach out for help and voluntarily engage for this reason. The language of the violence-informed, trauma-informed practice promoted in the report is not the language of binary adult victim-perpetrator paradigm, and shifting this is consistent with a shift in our mindset. The inverse care law states that the availability of care, and we could also argue social justice, varies inversely with the population's need for it. In other words, those most in need of care and social justice have least access to it. Families living with violence commonly have a broad range of coexisting needs. The more complex or complicated it is for families to meet these needs, the less likely they are to engage or stick with services. Conversely, the simpler our systems, the more engaging they become, the more opportunity people have to participate. Within this context, the committee's sixth report, again as it did in the fifth, promotes co-located multi-agency models. By capability, I mean the right amount of effective resource needed to achieve a goal. So resources may be workforce quantities, skills, space to work from, safe house beds or technologies. Some parts of our family violence system are well resourced, or let's say relatively well resourced. Others are extremely poorly resourced. Both the 80-20 and inverse care laws apply here. Whilst we need most men using violence to voluntarily reach out for help because their partner won't be calling the police or getting a protection order, this part of our system is the most poorly resourced. In Leslie Campbell's 2014 evaluation of Aviva's reach out service for men using violence, women reported being more willing to accept help when help was also available for their partner. Additionally, women reported becoming more willing to leave if their partner declined the offer of help. Effective voluntary services for men can enhance the effectiveness of services for women and children. It's also worth noting that this isn't achieved by individual practitioners providing pre-existing programs to non-mandated men, but by an integrated teamwork approach between professionals who share the primary goal in the first instance of enabling children and their families to become safe by collectively managing and reducing risk. Just as with women experiencing violence, our professional relationship with men using violence begins well before first contact. Our reputation, the stories people tell us, the stories people tell about us, the values and beliefs expressed through our marketing and communication strategies about men can either enhance or impede help seeking. Next slide, please. Our public and community marketing strategies are just one example of how our systems and structures generate emotions. So as we hopefully move forward to develop more effective services for men and all whānau members, I thought it would be helpful to promote the benefits of experience-based design technologies. These align with, but are not the same as co-design technologies, and include the powerful tool of emotion mapping to inform effective service systems design through the lens of lived experience. Importantly, emotion mapping can also help us to develop the right metrics, the right measurements, what I call emo metrics, to help us identify and measure over time whether what we're doing is making a difference and helpful for men and their whānau. Next slide, please. The Poverty Line, a poet by Bengali Tarapada Roy, has travelled with me over the years and pulled me through some significant moments of personal stuckness. In the poem, an extremely poor man living on the streets of Bangladesh recounts his many visits from an earnest researcher who proudly shares his academic insights and revelations into the man's experience of poverty. Here are the first two verses. I was poor, very poor. There was no food to quell my hunger, no clothes to hide the shame of my naked body, no roof above my head. You were so kind. You came and you said, no, poverty is a debasing word. It dehumanizes man. You are needy. My days were spent in dire need. My needy days, day after day, were never ending. As I grew weaker, again, you came. This time you said, look, I've thought it over. Need is not a good word either. You are destitute. And so the poem goes on. I offer this because whilst valuing this sixth report and every report with the potential to inform the development of our response to families living with violence, ultimately it will be the collective growth of a systems mindset driving socially just systems reform that's going to make the difference for children and their whānau. Next slide, please. So how might we achieve this? Certainly one of my own personal learnings over the years is that while Simon Sinek's, well-known and celebrated encouragement to start with why is important, what's equally important is that we follow this with a really considered focus on how. It's my experience in my own experience, it's relatively easy for organisations working to enable families to become safe to co-create a shared vision statement without necessarily raising the bar or significantly adjusting our practice model or operations. But how is where the change rubber hits the road. How is where we do or don't walk our talk. And any differences or conflicts between our intrinsic motivations become apparent. And there's good reason for this. One of the most important enablers of systems reform is the right policy drivers. Whilst I believe we actually still need to identify what the right policy drivers are for family violence systems reform, I also believe most of us would agree that there's one that is clearly strongly misaligned. The consequences of a competitive funding model is that whilst government calls for collaboration and system reform is dependent upon collaboration, the intrinsic motivation of poorly resourced organisations may be to compete or build partnerships to create a competitive edge in order to survive. Importantly, this also undermines our potential to co-create the social capital needed to build public and community resilience to violence and reduce over time the need for institutionalised interventions and supports. And just my final slide, please. I'd like to close with this quote from Leonardo da Vinci. One of the things that really encourages me about our shared COVID-19 experience is that when we share a powerful intrinsic motivation fueled by a sense of urgency, we can choose to become incredibly adaptable. Suddenly significant policies, even laws, are rapidly reformed or developed. We also saw this following the Canterbury earthquakes and the mosque attacks, and I'm sure we will see it again in the future. Families living with violence need some of this. Whilst we've come to expect it, family violence is still a national crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you very much to all of our speakers. We're going to be moving into the question and answer session now. So if we please could have the presenters turn on their cameras and be available to turn on your microphone when I direct a question to you. So thank you all for your very insightful and deep thinking comments on a wide range of issues. The process from here is we're going to spend the next 20 minutes trying to do some question and answers. So those questions have been coming to me to direct to you, and I will flag for you at the beginning that and for all of our participants. To our many participants, thank you for all of your thoughtful and insightful questions. We are going to try and get through as many questions and answers as we can right now, but all of your questions will be saved, and the Death Review Committee has committed to a process of reviewing those questions after the fact, even if we don't have a chance to answer them in this session. And they will come up with a process for trying to feedback answers to commonly asked questions or to feedback recommendations that go up from there. So, so I know for a start that we have a question or two directed to you, Jeremy, with thanks for your korero. So some of the questions for you are related to the engagement for men. Having been in this field for a while, do you see that anything is different in terms of the support services that we're offering for men? And people have asked you to speak particularly to questions related to programs for young people, young men and adolescents. And if you would be willing to address the concept about anger management as well, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll address the anger management question first, I guess. So I speak on my own, so from my own experience, it was actually an anger management course which led to my change. So for me, it was beneficial, being in a group environment. I know for a lot of the men that I've spoken to, that's maybe not what they need. And again, a lot of the anger management courses have the same protocols and policies and everything in place. And it really comes down to the individuals, I believe, that are facilitating or running those courses, which make the difference. So the potential for anger management courses to be really effective really comes down to the personnel that are put in place to run them. To the youth, and you know, to the question of youth and stuff like that, look, definitely that definitely needs to be in the equation somewhere. As part of the campaign and doing the program that I was doing, going and speaking and stuff like that, a lot of the times trying to get into schools or places where there was young youth and stuff like that, there was a lot of red tape and things like that because of the content we were speaking, and also that it may be too much for an adolescent mind to take in and stuff like that. But again, from my own personal experience, I was perpetrating domestic violence against my mum from the age of 10-ish. So the behaviours are starting to be displayed by children that are being damaged in this area at a very young age. So the earlier we can get intervention in those areas is so much, you know, it's got to be so much better for the people that are, you know, the men or the, you know, the young boys that are going forward. Can you just refresh me on what the first one was, Janet? Sorry.
So the first one, Tim, was Jeremy, was around, do you think anything is different in terms of the resourcing of programs for men now as compared to in previous years? Have we got our heads around that one yet?
No. Short-term answer, I don't believe. It's slowly moving, and I mean, since I've been working in this area, I've been told how slow the wheels of things work and stuff like that. But there is certainly starting to see, and I mean the report highlights it, that the men need to be involved. We need, you know, you can take, as Dennis alluded to and everyone's alluded to, you can take the victims away from a perpetrator, which is the model. But you know, without dealing with me as a perpetrator, all I do is move on to the next victim and then the next victim. You know, if there's no focus on me as a perpetrator and getting some help or my behaviour, then that, you know, that cycle just continues, but in with a different victim. It's slowly shifting. There are a few things, the likes of Safe Man, Safe Family that Tim's talked about, Hey Bro, other ones like that. There are lines coming up, but as we know, for any format, traditionally it's getting the men to engage and finding that silver bullet, so to speak, or something that we can get men to engage. Great.
Yeah. Thank you for that. All right. We've had another question come in for Tim. For Tim, if we accept that the dynamics of power and control are a key component of family violence, how do we get men to move away from the perceived benefits of exercising this power and control over their partners and children in order to voluntarily seek help? It seems a huge leap because the behavior is so normalized. That one's for you, Tim.
All right. Okay. Sorry. I think for me, the model of power control has been around for a long time, and it's one of the, I suppose, the key components and that sort of thing. And I suppose depending on who you talk to, would plays out differently. And I think one of the things for the work I've done with men, that all the men come with their own journeys. And first of all, like I might have shown on the Safe Man, Safe Family side, the first phase for that approach is to uncover your journey and to really get a key understanding of what that looks like. So for men who exercise power and control, to uncover their behaviour, understand the context from where that came from, and understand the impacts on their behaviour currently, then to be able to, from that understanding, learn some different ways of being. I think one of the things is that a lot of men who probably exercise power and control, they've learnt that over time, and it becomes the norm. So you're probably, oblivious to it. And for somebody like, I talked about unchecked privilege. I'm a middle-class white guy of relatively middle age, right? The system is my system. The system is designed in a way that allows me to navigate through it without sometimes any awareness or understanding of the kind of what people have described, the invisible knapsack of little tools that I carry with me, that I'm not questioned on certain things, that if I am able to navigate my way through the system and in a negative way in this space, are able to manipulate that system. I know, Jeremy, in your corridor, you've talked about the ability to manipulate when the police turn up, to sort of front as the victim, that sort of thing. I said, hey, I'm a misunderstood guy, and I think it's just another version of that. So I think for a lot of the men who use power and control, they need to have the light switched on, actually.
And I think that's really at the heart of the question, Tim. I think it's the bit about, we understand that there are those systems that hold the power in place, but how do we actually work to engage the men, men who may not see that privilege?
Well, I think we need probably more leadership from men of privilege to speak to it, actually. So we need more men of maybe of my demographic to speak to that privilege and actually own it. There's very few men. I mean, Jeremy will tell you, it's a pretty lonely journey fronting your story publicly. How many men do you know will publicly speak around their negative behaviour and the impact on their family and that sort of thing publicly on an ongoing basis? There's very few, and there's very few in my experience in this work and prior. And so, there's when do we hear men in leadership and powerful positions speak to that, on an ongoing basis? We only tend to hear it when it's responding to a crisis. And when the media asks for a response, where's the go-to? Often it's again, led by a response from, Dr. Anne's Jury and, the Women's Refuge Movement and that sort of thing. So we need to balance that really, and we need to speak to that as men.
Yeah. Yeah. So that leadership is super important. Yeah. Okay. All right, so I am managing questions across a couple of different screens, so I'm just going to have to kind of summarize and go with the gist of the next question. And I'm not sure if this is something that you, Dennis, would like to speak to, or other participant, Fiona Cram, who's available, but there is a lot of questions around the available resourcing for Māori-based kaupapa Māori programs, and really what is needed to get those programs adequately resourced. I'm going to direct that one to you, Fiona. Are you able to unmute, please?
Yes, Dennis can pitch in as well. I actually think the funding's fundamental to what Māori communities, what whānau want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen funding channeled into whānau ora
mm-hmm.
to provide a really good pathway into community-based services, prioritising what mm-hmm. whānau want, what they need, and mm-hmm. how they want to be and what they aspire to. So there's a really good platform mm-hmm. there for a further conversation about, I guess, the devolution of more funding.
Mm-hmm.
Because the government can't provide kaupapa Māori services. It can
mm-hmm.
provide Māori-centred services. It's communities mm-hmm. and community providers
mm-hmm.
who need to be funded to provide
mm-hmm.
kaupapa Māori or kaupapa Ngāti Porou or kaupapa Taranaki services, and really get to the nub of what local people want in order to build their connectedness and a collective resiliency, and ensure that women, men, children are pulled into a web of just care and support to enable them to achieve their full potential.
Kia ora, Fiona. My addition would be there is a wealth now of research and information around kaupapa Māori, which is met with accolades overseas, but not here. Taking this off online wānanga that Leonie Pihema, Tuhiwai Smith, Graham Henningaro Smith are running at the moment, they'd be very good to watch. However, from my position, anything that is promoted in this area, utilised for Māori, comes from kaupapa Māori models. It does more than just deal with the violence, the family violence, the sexual violence. It also reconnects. And this is the big thing with Māori and colonisation. We have been disconnected. So we must approach this also from a holistic point of view, not just the individual in terms of our whare tangata, tamariki and mokopuna being separated out, and let's have a look at them, all our men being separated out from whānau. It must be encompassed within whānau and hapu, a collective approach, not an individual one. So the models are there. It would seem to me that the most innovative approaches are actually coming from men that are unsupported and unfunded by government. Why is this? The cynical voice that I hear in the Māori world is that anything that works for Māori seems to be stopped by government. And the other whakataaki that we all know of these days, hopefully, is whatever works for Māori will work for everybody else. It is about honouring the treaty and equity for Māori, and it is about, as has been said by our great speakers, restoration of mana, not just for Māori men, but for Māori across the whole system, in partnership with equality. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you for that. All right. I think we are running out of time for questions, because I do want to leave time for us to close this session properly. Again, if you haven't had an opportunity to have your questions answered, know that we are still keeping a really careful record of all of the questions that have come in. And that, again, the Death Review Committee has committed to reviewing those and hopefully coming up with a list of frequently asked questions. I also want to finish with a really big thank you to all of the presenters and for all of our audience attendees, so that for your patience with the process. And I understand a few of you had some technical difficulties in hearing. Please understand that we are all working from lots of different settings across the country with lots of different levels of Wi-Fi. So hopefully the recording will help you process the information if you couldn't get it this time. The recording will be made available through the Family Violence Death Review Committee website and also through the New Zealand Family Violence Clearinghouse website. I would ask your patience with that and say that we will have it up hopefully in the next couple of days, either toward the end of this week or the beginning of next. We're working with some limited resources with the home offices, so it may take us a little bit of time to get that up. And we won't get it to you any faster if you email us and ask. Know that we're going to do that as soon as we can. Okay, so I'll finish with asking, but just before I pass over to Dennis, again, thank you all for your participation and your interest around this today. We will be sending out a short survey about how you found this webinar so that we have the opportunity for feedback. That will come to you at the end of the participation in this session, and also through, via email. So if you could take a couple of minutes just to fill that out for us, that would be awesome. All right, we all recognize that this report is the beginning of a process rather than the end. So we thank the Death Review Committee again for all of their work and insight and thoughtfulness in putting it together, and to the panelists for their wonderful insights today. And I will pass over to Dennis to close.
Kia ora, Janet. Just like to tautoko acknowledgement of the committee, and especially our speakers today and your insights and experience in this area. Also to acknowledge all the participants that have joined us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and from around the world. I'd like to acknowledge especially those men on this call that are standing up and being counted in this area, and also to all of the women that not have only been at the receiving end of this, but have carried the weight of this for us men for so long. Ka nui ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. So as we started, because this is not just a report that deals with words on paper, but it is also connected with loss of people and death in this area and other areas. This means that this work is tapu in the indigenous thought of these people in this land, and that this is wairua work. And so as we begin, we finish. Nō reira me noi tātou. So let's complete correctly. Kia tau mai ngā manaakitanga o te mea ngaro ki runga ki tēnā o tātou. Kia mā hea te mā kihi. Nō reira unu he te uru tapu nui. Kia māma kia wāte, te ngā kouta hene ngaro, te wairua, I te arataka tū. Whakauria ki runga e rongo, ai rā ko wāte. Rire, pai mā rire. Tēnā tātou. Thank you very much.